So, as I was saying, the topic for tonight is trying to make sense of a Catalan conflict within the framework of the Spanish Constitution. And I have fundamentally three main goals. So I would like to explain the framework, so what the Constitution says. I would like to say how the events of the last 2 months fit or don't within the constitutional framework. And I would like to debunk some myths that have been going around. And I'm just borrowing the expression sloganeering populism that Professor Phil Sirpis has coined to talk about Brexit, but I think it also fits the conflict. So along the way, I will just mention some issues that are not even post-fact truth or fake news, they're just blatant lies. This is pretty complicated. It's a lot of information, and I have tried to structure it in 4 main blocks. The first one being just trying to explain what is the general model. So when you have heard things about what the Spanish Constitution says or doesn't say, and this now famous Article 155 of the Constitution, what does it all mean? Basically, as you know, Spain had a civil war, 36 to 39. It ended with the dictatorship of General Franco. Franco died, and from 1976, we had a transition towards democracy. And the transition basically culminated with the approval of a new constitution. And it's a constitution that was voted by every single province in Spain. And in particular, in Catalonia, the vote was very, very high. So I don't know if you can see the numbers, but fundamentally, around 67 to 68% of the population voted in each of the provinces in Catalonia. And the approval of the constitution was above 90% of those who voted, which represents above 60% in all the provinces in Catalonia. So this is a constitution that was wanted and voted positively in Catalonia, that created the framework not only for the relationship between Catalonia and Spain, but for the working of Spain and the territorial organization of the state. And it's a state that it's pretty much more complicated than we would think, because it's a state that the Constitution defines as a single state, which is based on one people and one nation, and the state is based on the indivisibility of its territory, as you could expect from most constitutions, but also because of the historical facts and the existence of people with different senses of belonging and different identities. It also recognizes the possibility for different nationalities to coexist within one nation. And that was a drafting that is just a compromise, trying to say there is one state for different nationalities, but there's only one nation. So it's not a federation. It's not like the United Kingdom, when you have different nations within one country, or different countries within one nation, depending on how you want to use the words. This is just one state with different regions. And the regions are recognized in their autonomy. The Constitution enshrines that the devolution to the regions is going to be as broad as possible, and it also recognizes the languages. So the second thing that is very important is that in Catalonia, Catalan is co-official with Spanish. It's not in a second level. The same way that Basque is co-official with Spanish in the Basque Country, or Galician is co-official with Spanish in Galicia. So in those regions where there is a language, they're both equally official. So the Constitution simply establishes them on equality. But we are not only looking at these 3 or 4 regions with historical background. Spain is divided in 17 autonomous communities and 2 autonomous cities in the north of Africa. And if you're interested in colonialism, we could discuss that later. But fundamentally, we have 17 very different regions with different types of population, different levels of economic development, and different levels of tradition and aspiration to self-government. So the Constitution had to create a framework that was flexible. And it did it by fundamentally creating a 2-tier constitutional regulation. So we have the Constitution, which is the same for the whole of Spain, and then each of the regions has its own statute of autonomy, which is like a regional constitution that tailors the constitutional rules to that specific region. And the split of powers, or the split of competencies between the central state and each of the autonomous regions is explained in Articles 148 and 49 of the Constitution, which are too lengthy to discuss here, but fundamentally they create 3 types of competencies. They create exclusive competence for the central state, defense, judiciary, the very traditional functions of the state, and then it creates a very long list of competencies that can be adopted by the regions if they want them. Transport, education, healthcare, regulation of commerce, property. These are things that can be regionalized if the regions want them. If they don't want them, the state retains them. So basically, we have competencies that can be either regional or state, depending on the statute of autonomy. And then, of course, this is a final clause that says if something is not allocated to anybody, the state will do it, because somebody has to take care of things. And the arbiter of this split of competencies is the Constitutional Court, which basically can know of conflicts brought either by the central state or by the regions on the basis that some competence is misallocated or infringes on the competencies of the other. So if a region thinks that the state is overreaching, they can take the state to the Constitutional Court and have the national rule quashed, and that has happened. Now, because this system was foreseen to be potentially difficult to implement, in particular because once you devolve the power to a region, you don't know how the region is going to exercise that power, there's, of course, a protective clause, which is this Article 155, that says that if at some point one region is not complying with the obligations that the Constitution or the law imposes on them, the central government can require them to comply, and if they don't comply, then they can take whatever measures necessary to ensure compliance with the constitutional order. This is basically just a rule to say if a region doesn't exercise the autonomy given to it in the statute in accordance with the Constitution, the autonomy can be taken back. That's what it says. And it doesn't say anything else. So if you look at it, for the complexities of a situation where you need to apply this article, there's not much detail. It doesn't say for how long. It doesn't say what checks and balances we need. The only thing it does is create a procedure. The procedure means the government proposes the measures to Senate, which is the upper house of the parliament. The Senate approves the measures, and then the government can exercise them. So now, on hindsight, most people say Article 155 was simply drafted as a deterrent, never to be used. That's why it's so imperfect. Same things they say about Article 50 on the Treaty on Leaving the European Union. It was meant there to spend, just to get people scared, never to be used. But now we have seen it used, and we will see what happens there. So this is for the general framework. Now, how does Catalonia fit in that framework? So to what extent is Catalonia self-governed? Well, since 1978, things have changed a lot. In 1978, Catalonia was recognized as one of the 4 regions with historical aspirations, and it was given, at the time, the maximum level of competencies that were transferred, which were 89 different competencies, all sorts of things, fisheries, transport. In that initial time, you had things reserved to the state around security, but everything else was sort of transferred. And from then on, more and more competencies have been transferred. In the 80s, there were transfers around education and healthcare. Later, we have had infrastructure. We have had the police, which is now regional, as you will have seen in the newspapers. The Mossos are the Catalan police. And that's because the state transferred policing to the region. And as you see, in 2010, when it reached the maximum level, they had acquired a total of 274 competencies, which basically means most things are self-governed, excluding the judiciary, excluding the military, and excluding a few things about budget control and a few things about interterritorial solidarity. But these were things that, of course, could not be transferred to Catalonia because that would change the model. So at some point, Catalonia had reached the ceiling of what could be transferred, and any further transfers would go against the competences that are exclusive for the state. So they would require constitutional reform, and there was no intention to change the constitution. So that's where they thought transfers are not sufficient, we want more. Before we get there, what does this mean? What does these 274 competencies mean? There's a study published by Oxford University Press, so I don't think it can be biased or at least considered in the interest of anybody, which looks at the whole world and every region and creates different metrics on how self-governed regions are. Yeah, as they call it, it's a post-functional approach to governance. And Catalonia is at the top of the levels of regions for level of decision-making, for level of competencies, second only to 4 regions in the world. It's at the top level for legislative power, because it has its own parliament with its own legislative powers. Highest level of executive power, because its executive is independent when it's exercising its competencies. One of the highest levels in terms of taxation, And the only thing where it's a bit below that, but still well above the median, is the ability to indebt itself, simply because indebtedness and budgetary control is something that belongs to the state. So it has to be agreed between the state and Catalonia. So you would think that this is a region that features really, really high in autonomy. It's very difficult to understand some claims that more devolution is necessary when you look a bit further below. So I don't know if you can read it, but for instance, the German countries, the Länder, are below Catalonia in almost everything. And nobody really claims that the German Länder are not self-governed. So it's difficult to understand this. It's also difficult to understand when we look at how the public sector is split in Catalonia. What this represents in yellow is the volume of the Catalan public servants and people that are employed by the Catalan sector, the regional one. In gray, it's the local one. And in blue, it's the national one. So if you look at local plus regional, which is most of what determines governance, you will see that it's about 10 times the volume of the civil servants employed by the central state in Catalonia. If we add universities, which have a special treatment, it's even bigger. So basically, most of the people executing at below government level, the policies of the government, are employed by the Catalan administration. So you would also think that this gives, on a day-to-day basis, a lot of autonomy. And also important is how have things changed? Because you would have thought, well, if this was the situation in 2010, what has happened afterwards? And I will just try to give you some long view. I don't want to go back to the 16th century because I don't think it's going to help us much. My analysis is limited to what's happened, let's say, in the last 15 years, which I think is interesting. And one of the things we can look at, and again, apologies because this is small, is what is the feeling about self-government and devolution that is in Catalonia. The top is a question about whether you think that you have sufficient, insufficient, or too much autonomy. And what you can see is that the people thinking that the autonomy is insufficient, which is the gray line on top, is basically 2/3 of the Catalan population throughout. It goes up above 70% in the early 2000s, it goes down, but it's usually 2/3 of people think they want more autonomy. But when you ask them, how would you like to achieve that more autonomy? The graph below gives basically 3 options. The green one is whether you want to stay as you are, an autonomous region within Spain. The yellow one is wanting to be a state in a federal Spain, so basically you want to change the model of the state in Spain but still remain within. And the gray one is the one that wants an independent state. So what you can see is that none of the options carries more than 30% of the population. So even within those that want more autonomy, how to achieve it, it's not clear at all. But you will also notice that there's a very high spike that then fades down on people that want a separate state. So let's look at what happened there. And because it cannot be seen, this is around 2013, right? The second thing that is important, and I think I would also stress this from a more socio-economic perspective, is why can we identify this? How can we trace it to different people in society? The first thing is that the biggest spike in the intention of independence comes from people voting 2 parties. What used to be Esquerra Republicana and what used to be Convergència, which were 2 parties that existed from 1978. They have participated in every election that at some point flipped their position from more autonomy to independence. So this is not people changing political party, it's political parties changing approach to more autonomy. And the second thing that is important is by level of rent. So do you have in the second graph, in blue is people that oppose independence, in red it's people that want independence, and it's organized by income in the household per month. So those that live in households that have an income of less than 1,800 to 2,400 euros are opposed to independence. Whereas those that have that household income or above want independence, which means there is a class issue involved in the dialogue, and some people have called this bourgeois independentism, right? So if you're well off, you can afford to want to have independence. If you are just about managing, probably you just don't worry about independence. You actually want to have something different. So this is an important element in the political discourse. It's also important to understand the timeline of things. So it's very complicated to create causation. So I'm not going to say any of these events have an immediate effect. But I think that looking at them is going to help us. What happened is that when the transfer of competencies was flattening out at the top, the Catalan government wanted more autonomy. And the Spanish government would go back and say, at the time it was a socialist government, saying, look, we are reaching the ceiling of Article 148, 149, we cannot give you anything else. And what they said, they say, well, we will draft a new Statute of Autonomy, so we will change our regional constitution, and we will see if we can get that additional competence this way. They drafted and negotiated, and it was a very long process, a new Statute of Autonomy, and it's a requirement that the Statute of Autonomy has to be subjected to a referendum. And in the referendum for the Statute of Autonomy, we had an election that had about 49% people voting, and of that 49%, about 73% said they wanted the new Statute of Autonomy, which represents about 27% of the population. That's just a fact. Let's not infer anything from here. That meant that the statute was approved at the Catalan level, and then it went up for approval at Parliament, in the Central Parliament in Spain. It got also approved. It was going to be enacted into force, and the opposition in Spain at the time, led by Mr. Rajoy, today the Prime Minister of Spain, but at the time the leader of the opposition, thought that the Statute of Autonomy violated Article 148 and brought it to the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court took its sweet time, and in 2010 shaved the Statute of Autonomy significantly. So basically it annulled some of its articles, and it subjected some of the other articles to specific interpretations that didn't quite fit the original intent. The thing that was identified as the most incendiary is that in the preamble to the Statute of Autonomy, it was made a reference that Catalonia was a nation, and that was quashed by the Constitutional Court, saying, no, you are a nationality in accordance with Article 2 of the Constitution, but you are not a nation, because there's only one nation, which is the Spanish nation under Article 1. And that was politically the one message. They don't recognize us as a nation. That led somehow to the elections that were scheduled to take place in the fall of 2010, and these were elections where there was a bit of an increase in independentist and autonomist vote, but not a big change. But of course, those parties kept on campaigning with the logo. They did not recognize that we are a nation. And they felt in the polls that people were angry at the decision of the Constitutional Court, so they called for a snap election in 2012. And that was a snap election where they gained some power. So they continued with the same rhetoric and the same campaigning, and in 2013, they passed a declaration in Parliament saying that the Catalan nation is sovereign and it has the right to decide whether it stays within Spain with the trimmed down statute or it goes out. And in 2013, and it's really, if you like epic, if you like big images, in 2013, on the 11th of September, which is the National Day of Catalonia, they managed to organize a 400-kilometer human chain that crossed Catalonia from south to north, uninterrupted, 1.2 million people demonstrating, saying, we are sovereign, we want to decide. They felt emboldened by this, so they organized the first illegal referendum. They called it a consultative plebiscite, but it was a vote that was prohibited by the Constitutional Court, saying you cannot ask the Catalan people whether they want to be independent for two reasons. One, because that's against the Constitution, but the second one, and this is purely technical, because you don't have the competence to ask for a referendum, because the only one that can call a referendum is the National Parliament. They carried on, regardless, 9th of November, 9N, and we have about 41% of turnout, which carries about 80% yes. Of that, 42%, which is about 30% of the population. Roughly the same numbers that voted yes to the Statute of Autonomy. And emboldened by this, they called a second snap election. And again in this election, they won power, but they had one difficulty, and we'll come back to him, that the Catalan president at the time, Mr. Mas, was now going to be prosecuted because of having called this illegal referendum. So they win the election, but they cannot use him as president because they know that he's going to go to jail. So that's when Mr. Puigdemont comes in and steps as president of the Generalitat, even if he was not leading the lists. And he enters into a coalition with other independentist parties, particularly CUP, which is a grassroots movement, and we'll come back to that. And after few discussions that are not relevant, in September 2017, they decide to give effect to what they call the route to independence, which means in the Catalan parliament, they approved two laws. One on the 6th of September, which is the Referendum on Self-Determination Act, calling for a referendum to be held in October. And on the next day, actually 2 days after, because the vote was completed after midnight, the Legal Transition and Foundation of the Republic Act. These two votes happened with all of the opposition absent from Parliament, because they didn't want to participate, and with the legal advisors to the Catalan Parliament saying, this is unconstitutional and it's against the procedure, so you cannot pass these laws. Regardless, they give effect to the law on the Self-Determination Act and have the second legal referendum, the one you have seen on the 1st of October, where, again, we have about 43% of people voting. There's a claim that because of the circumstances under which the referendum took place, about 770,000 votes were lost, but we will never know, which means that the yes, in this case 92% of those who voted, still represents about 27% of the population. So remember this, 3 different votes in 3 different cases, and by the data of the government, same result. Now, the day of the referendum is something that I don't think anybody would want to see. And I think it's agreed. The police engage in some brutality that is shameful, and it's not justifiable. Now, that being said, those are independent facts. But the way it was reported is really doubtful. This map from Avui, which is one of the main independentist journals, basically depicts something you would think is describing warfare. Just the images of it. The actual fact is that much less people were involved in these violence acts. If you want to look at it by yourself, the government has published a report in English, because they want everybody to know, where they claim there have been 1,000 victims. Of those 1,000 victims, more than 800 had some contusion. So basically, they were hit. But only about 40 had concussions, which are serious. Only 1 required stitches, and someone had a heart attack. But I really don't think you can link them. So the rhetoric around the victims is not really objective reporting. Also, we had lots of fake news. Most of the pictures you have seen online, fake. You will have seen the police fighting the fire people. That was from 2013, and it was the fire people raising against the Catalan government because they wanted a race, and the national police defending the Catalan government. But they use it now as saying the firemen protect the people and the police attack them. Not true. People bleeding? Not true. If you want to check, all of those are in this link. And there were things that were not reported, which were mobs against the police. So the police, at the end of the 1st of October, go back to their accommodation, which, by the way, they had to be either in a boat, because most people owning hotels would not host them, or to specific hotels, and they were mobbed. There were mobs outside shouting at them. They did not react. So these are all things that were not reported, and I think they're important to know. But beyond that, 1st of October was one among many demonstrations. So what we have seen, and I'm really surprised by this, is really large demonstrations of different signs, really carefully, always scheduled not to coincide, and there's not been a fight on the streets between the 2 different positions. And I think that that's quite remarkable in itself. So on the 3rd of October, we had a general strike condemning the police violence of the 1st of October. Nobody went to oppose the independent movement demonstrating. On the 7th of October, we had a peaceful demonstration by a new platform, simply saying, we want to talk. Nobody went to shut them down. On the 8th of October, we had an anti-independentist rally, and people that wanted independence did not go to oppose them. So basically, the streets have been taken in turn, and peacefully. But we have only heard about the pro-independence demonstrations. But there have been a few more. And also quite remarkable, the king gave 2 speeches. The first one on the 3rd of October, just at the end of the day, when there had been this general strike in Catalonia, and his discourse was really firm. But he basically said, we need to go back to the constitutional order. And I will come back to that. This was seen as too tough not wanting to engage with those that want independence, not giving them space. And it was criticized as being a Spanish government speech, as if the Spanish government had drafted it for him. So he took a second opportunity in the context of the Princess of Asturias prizes, which are prizes given every year, like the Spanish Nobel Prizes, if you want, where the European Union was given the Peace Prize, and he gave a speech that was even stronger. It called them an unacceptable secessionist attempt. And Tajani, President of the European Parliament, and all the other European representatives gave speeches that were strongly supportive of the, what you could call, centralist approach of the king. And that's also very important, because the king doesn't get to talk when he wants. He can only give speeches in very important moments. So that's something remarkable. And in the meantime, and for those of you that are not Spanish, this gentleman here, he's not a politician. He's called Gila. And he was, he did stand-up, right? And his thing was that the enemy would call the other, say, the enemy there, can they come here? Can we agree about this? You know, my weapons are broken, whatever. It's very funny. But it's not funny when I explain it, and it's definitely not funny when we are talking about the Catalan and the Spanish government trying to talk, right? So we have this crisis. We have had the legal referendum. We have had the king calling for going back to the constitutional order. And what happens is that Puigdemont goes to the Catalan parliament, declares independence, and immediately suspends it. Something that nobody really understands. And of course, faced with that, Rajoy sends a letter saying, did you declare independence? Can you please confirm whether you have declared independence? And gives him a week. To which Puigdemont answers, I don't know if I declared it or not, but I don't like your letter. To which Rajoy says, look, your way out is to call for elections. Call for elections, let's call it quits. And Puigdemont rejects it. So at that point, basically, when you have Puigdemont saying, I'm going to go to the Catalan parliament and I'm going to get finally the Declaration of Independence into effect, Rajoy says, fine, but then I'm going to activate Article 155. And on the 21st of October, a Saturday, in an extraordinary Council of Ministers, they draft what they would want to be the measures that Senate would approve. What do they propose Senate to approve? Basically, they don't want to suspend autonomy. They just want to intervene the government and the parliament, which are the ones that they think are distorting the way the autonomy is operating. So basically, they want to be able to sack and replace the government, to dissolve the Catalan parliament and call for elections, probably within 6 months, subject to there being enough guarantees for elections. They want to intervene public media owned by the Catalan region, and in particular TV3, which is the television station. And they want for the Catalan parliament not to be able to appoint a new Catalan government in the meantime. These are the four main things they want. While this is about to be discussed, the immediate reaction from the Catalan government, particularly by Mr. Puigdemont, is to say this is the worst attack on Catalan institutions since the Franco regime. I will press ahead talking in the Catalan parliament, and they reject the possibility of fresh elections, saying this is not on the tables, and they treat us as a colony. We will not have elections when they want. Which brings us to last week, the Article 155 week. The week starts with both the Catalan and the Spanish parliaments, in the Spanish case, the Senate, deciding how the week will pan out. They both decide to have important meetings and votes on Thursday and Friday. So there's this fight for Wednesday, right? So will the Senate allow Puigdemont to go and appear before Senate on Wednesday so he can still participate in the Catalan parliament on Thursday and Friday? Or will he have to go on Thursday and therefore potentially have to change the schedule of the Catalan parliament? Well, in the end, what happens is that on Thursday, Puigdemont has no intention to go, ends up sending some written submission, which arrives late because faxes get stuck and these sorts of things. It's a bit weird. But he tells the press, at 1:30, I'm going to announce snap elections. Everybody's waiting for 1:30. It gets pushed back to 2:30. And at 2:30 it gets cancelled, but he's expected to talk before the Catalan parliament starts session before 5 p.m. Everybody's really hoping he's going to call for elections. We can stop things in the Senate. That's what's going to happen. And then flips, decides not to call for elections, and on Friday they vote the Declaration of Independence, and within half an hour, but this is not orchestrated, just that things were going in parallel, the Senate approves Article 155. So within 1 hour we have the two biggest constitutional changes ever in Catalonia and in the context of Spain. What does each of these mean? Well, the Unilateral Declaration of Independence on Twitter, it's been called the fake DUI. DUI stands for Declaración Unilateral de Independencia. Why? Because basically they told the vote and they said, we're going to vote about this. All of the opposition left because they didn't want to be part of it. And when they were about to vote, they said, oh, but we're going to vote in secret, which had not been accepted. But they, by majority of themselves, decide that they're going to vote in secret. So they bring a ballot box. And as they call people to vote, that we're going to vote no to declaring independence, they show their votes, which is an infringement of the secret vote. What they were trying to do is try to avoid their criminal liability. But then 3 people that said they would vote no did not show their votes. So now we don't know who voted yes or no, except a few that said no. But what that happens in the end is we have 70 of the Catalan parliamentarians voting for independence, and they say, this is approved, we are now an independent republic. The second trick is that what they read out before the vote was the preamble of what they were voting. So everything that says here, which is, we constitute the Catalan Republic, we put this in notice of the international community, we want to negotiate with the Spanish state on an equal-to-equal basis, this is the preamble. This is not what they decided. What they decided means nothing. It's a very loose drafting. So in the end, this is fake because it's not legally binding. But that's enough to say we're just going ahead with Article 155. So what does Senate approve? Senate in Spain approves by 214 of 266 votes, with 47 senators voting against, 1 abstaining, and I think there were 4 sick that were not present. They decide that they approve the measures that the government had asked, except for one. They don't authorize the intervention of the Catalan media. They say that's going too far. And it's something, again, unprecedented. It's published in the Spanish official gazette, which is meant to be published once a day, within 1 hour. They had a special online editions just so that this could be effective. Again, very interesting for constitutional lawyers. Which takes us to how is this perceived, what's happening now. International reaction. In red, those that have said we don't recognize it. In yellow, those that have said maybe we can consider it politically. It's very small to see, but basically you have nobody supporting it, right? And this is interesting because this is a map from the Ariara, which is the other independentist newspaper. So basically these were people that were hoping to have a green map, and now they have a red map. But still, they keep it in their website, which says something about them. Does the Constitution help us understand all this craziness? To some extent, right? So why did the central government act the act they did? Because they can do nothing else. At the beginning, they didn't have the power to dissolve the Catalan parliament to call for elections. They had to go to Senate and ask for it. And they wanted to keep time. That's why it took 1 week to get things through Senate. They could have done it in 3 days. But they just wanted to keep the opportunity of elections open. Did the Catalan government act in accordance with the Constitution? No. So the constitutional framework doesn't really support what they did. They were in breach of the Constitution, and I think that their claims that they are oppressed, that they don't have self-government, just don't tail up with the facts that I gave you at the beginning of the talk. And about the king, he's also been really criticized for sticking to the Constitution, which is something that, in fairness, it's the best you can expect from a king, which is completely unelected, not accountable to anybody, and the only thing he's done is to say, guys, what we have is the Constitution, we stick to the Constitution for now. So I think it explains it somehow. The problem is that it doesn't explain what's going to happen now. Because now, it's not about constitutional law anymore, now it's about criminal law. And things are going to get pretty ugly for quite a few people very soon. Why? Well, you could ask, why have these people not been brought to jail before? If you think that they did something wrong. Or you could ask, why are they going to be brought to jail at all? They're just engaging in the political process. So I'll just try to explain what the criminal code says, and then you can draw your own conclusions. Now, there's a few crimes that are relevant. The first one is sedition. Sedition is a crime committed by those that in public and tumultuously, so basically creating disorder, and outside of the legal channels, want to prevent the application of the law or administrative or judicial decision. So basically, you are preventing the effectiveness of the legal order. And we have 4 people already investigated for sedition, which are, from top to bottom, left to right, the head of the Catalan police, the second in the Catalan police, and 2 leaders of civil associations that were running the mobs against the police on the 21st of September. These people basically were opposing judicial decisions because the police, when they acted against them, were enforcing judicial mandates to go and investigate or to go and seize information. And preventing the police from doing their job is in itself sedition. There's going to be a whole lot more people investigated for sedition. Everybody that voted for the Declaration of Independence will be investigated at least for sedition because they are opposing the Constitutional Court's judgments that that vote should not take place. So this is going to be a very important article applied throughout. There's a more serious crime, which is rebellion. Rebellion requires for you to raise publicly and violently to either negate the Constitution or declare the autonomy of a region within Spain. And the big question here is, have we had violence? And the General Prosecutor in Spain has created arguments to say that there was violence because at least there was the impossibility to be sure that there would not be violence. I think this is far-fetched, and I don't think we will see Puigdemont or Junqueras or others convicted for rebellion. But that doesn't really matter, because if you fall short of rebellion, you certainly fall within sedition. And they will all be prosecuted for sedition as well. And we have a precedent, because this gentleman here, Mr. Artur Mas, the previous president of the Generalitat in Catalonia, the one that organized the 9 November first illegal referendum, was convicted. He was not convicted for sedition, but he was convicted for disobedience. Yeah? Because he had explicitly been told you cannot run with the referendum, and he still did it. He's been convicted. He has been convicted to 24 months, where he is not able to run for political office. But more importantly, he's now being claimed paying back the cost of that illegal referendum from his own pocket. It's some 5.2 million euro, which is like 600 million pounds now at the exchange rate of today. It's a lot of money, right? And this is the minimum that is going to happen to Puigdemont and the others. At the very least, they will be convicted for disobedience, and they will be asked to pay back the money. But I think they will be probably convicted for sedition. Now, what now, right? This is a mess. Criminal law is not going to organize it all. Well, my guess is as good as yours. But this is what I think is going to happen. So this weekend was not good forecast of what's going to happen. I was really worried. I actually should have gone to Barcelona this last weekend. Decided to cancel the trip because I didn't know what was going to happen. And it's been surprisingly quiet. This is Mr. Puigdemont on Saturday morning taking a picture and posting it on Twitter with a junior basketball team, as if nothing happened. You know, I declared independence today, and tomorrow I go to my local neighborhood basket player. He did broadcast a video message, but basically he simply said, I call for democratic opposition to the effectiveness of Article 155 intervention, which means nothing, because you cannot democratically oppose to it. And then Junqueras, which is his vice president, issued one column of opinion yesterday in the newspapers, basically not saying nothing new. So you would thought, you know, war would happen this weekend. It was very quiet, surprisingly. And today, well, it's a bit of a mix. And this is only as of 3:20 p.m., so things may have changed. But the morning starts with Mr. Puigdemont putting on Instagram, this guy really likes social media, a picture from inside the presidential palace of the Generalitat de Catalunya saying good morning. So everybody understood, well, he's in the office, right? Except it was not cloudy in Barcelona today. Yeah, so this picture is not from today. He is in Brussels with 5 of the ministers, deposed ministers of his cabinet, planning to ask for political asylum. That's where he is now. Apparently they drove to Marseille in the middle of the night and then took a flight from Marseille. Whereas other members of the sacked regional government have shown up to work, which adds another disobedience and another crime of usurpation of functions to the long list. So I don't know which one I prefer, the one that runs or the one that stays. I just don't know. And the other thing is how to get out of this. Well, elections have been called for the 21st of December. Hopefully the new elections will bring an end to the intervention by the Spanish government of the Catalan government. But the problem is, what can we expect from these elections? And what we can expect is very unsettling, because this poll is from 1 week ago, and it basically says if the elections had been 1 week ago, would have exactly the same results that we had in the constitution of the Catalan parliament and the enactment of the Catalan government that have just been deposed. Which means this may be just a never-ending situation. And in Spain, actually, we are used to it. So a couple of years ago, we had general elections. We could not form a government. Had the second election. They could still not form a government. And we were about to have the third election until they realized, well, you know, maybe we should stop asking the same question. We're going to have the same answer. We may have this situation here, but jokes aside, I don't know what this means politically. Because if the solution was to have elections, but the elections reiterate the same problem, I don't know what's going to happen. And we have a big problem in terms of how do we arrive to that result. People in different political spectrum have been asked, what would you vote if you had the opportunity in the next election? And once we know which party would you vote, what do you want? Do you want independence, more autonomy, or you're happy the way things are? And what we see is a very big polarization. So here first, we have Esquerra, which are the ones that have traditionally been pro-independence. 70% of their base wants independence. That's to be expected. The second one we have is the political party of Mr. Puigdemont, which were traditionally anti-independence, pro-more autonomy. And it's 50-50. Okay, so that apparently was not what they wanted to hear. Anyway, that was my last slide. So the main issue is we don't know what's going to come from the elections, but I don't think it's going to be the end of it. And I think that it's true that law cannot resolve this. This is a political issue from now on. And I just don't know where we're going to go with the politics. So thank you for your attention, and I'm really willing to engage in questions and answers, so please ask questions.